have always loved taking Thor, my dog, for an early morning walk. I'd wake up, grab his leash and his ball, and off we'd go to the woods. It was a peaceful place, full of old trees, with a few clearings where people would take their kids and pets to play. I loved the fresh morning air, the smell of the leaves, and the sound of the birds. It was the time of day when I truly felt at peace. We enjoyed walking there, with that silence broken only by the birds and Thor's footsteps on the trail. It was our moment, and Thor, eager to play, would run ahead, happy as can be. I always took a rubber ball, threw it far, and he'd fetch it, as if it were the most important job in the world. One of those mornings, I picked up the ball that Thor loved and started throwing it for him to fetch. Everything was normal. I'd throw the ball, he'd run, grab it, and come back with that happy face, as if it were the best thing in the world. But then, in one of those throws, I tossed the ball a bit farther than usual and he sprinted off. Only this time, he took a while to come back. I got a bit worried. I started calling for him. "Thor, come on, boy." Nothing. That's when I heard him barking from deeper in the woods. I followed the sound and found Thor standing in front of a more isolated tree, barking as if he had seen something. I kept trying to figure out what it was, but I didn't see anything strange. Maybe a squirrel, I thought. He always got like that when he saw one. The next day and the day after, the same thing happened. I'd throw the ball, Thor would run, but when he got close to that tree, he'd stop and start barking, always looking up. I started getting curious. Something there was bothering him, but I couldn't see what it was. In the days that followed, the same thing happened. Every day, when I threw the ball in that direction, Thor would go to fetch it and end up at that same tree. Why was Thor reacting like that only there? It was like he was seeing something I couldn't see. And I admit I started getting intrigued. Why that tree? It was a tree like any other, a bit older maybe, but nothing seemed special about it. Yet he insisted, always barking and looking up. After a few days of pondering this, I decided I needed to see up close what was happening. That morning, I followed Thor to the tree and started climbing. The branches were thick but covered in moss and a bit slippery. I climbed slowly, feeling the damp wood under my hands, and then I saw it. Between two higher branches, wedged in a hole, there was a doll. It was all dirty, its hair tangled, its face covered in dark stains that looked like mold. It seemed like it had been there for many years. I didn't touch the doll. I left it where it was. Something about the scene disturbed me deeply. I climbed down the tree with a strange, uncomfortable feeling. Thor was still down below, looking up and growling softly. That day, on my way home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The doll, the way Thor reacted, like there was something wrong there. How did that old doll end up in that tree? Near home, I ran into Mrs. Emma, an elderly lady who had lived in the neighborhood forever. She was watering her garden on the sidewalk, and Thor immediately ran over to sniff the flowers. Mrs. Emma started petting Thor, who adored her. I took the chance to make some small talk, and in the middle of the conversation, I asked about that particular tree. "Mrs. Emma, you know the woods nearby, right? There's a big, somewhat isolated tree. Thor always barks at it like there's something there. Do you know if there's anything strange about that tree?" She stopped petting Thor for a moment and looked at me in a somewhat strange way. "Oh, that tree. I know it well. When I was young, there was a little girl in the neighborhood who loved playing there. She used to climb that tree all the time, said it was her castle. One day she climbed too high. She fell and, well, she didn't survive." I was silent, trying to digest that information. "And the doll?" I asked, not even knowing why. "Oh, yes," she continued. "She always carried a doll with her. It was her favorite toy, a gift from her grandfather. After she fell, nobody ever saw the doll again." A chill ran down my spine. That thing with Thor barking at the tree, always looking up. Suddenly, it all started to make sense, at least a little. I thanked Mrs. Emma and went on my way, my head full of questions. Was Thor sensing something? Something that was still there? The next day, I went back to the woods. I won't lie, I was nervous. When I got close to the tree, Thor started barking again, as usual. I kept looking up, trying to see what he saw. With some difficulty, I could see, high up, caught between two branches, the doll. It was dirty, its face faded, its dress torn. It looked like it had been there for decades, just as Mrs. Emma had said. I didn't want to touch the doll or take it down. Something told me it should stay exactly where it was. I went home, with Thor always looking back, as if he were suspicious. After that, I kept going to the woods, but I avoided that part. Thor did too. He still looked in that direction, but he no longer barked. It was as if he knew that now we understood. Something had happened there, something that still lingered in the air. The doll remained there, stuck in the branches, and I had no intention of messing with whatever was still held in that tree.
I started working as a babysitter to earn some extra money. You know, college doesn't pay for itself, and I already knew some families in the neighborhood, so the job was always easy. But that week, I got a call from a woman I'd never heard of. She sounded nervous, maybe even a bit desperate, but she offered me good money to look after her son, a 10-year-old boy, for a week. She had to work late and wanted someone trustworthy. I agreed. On the first day, everything was fine. I arrived in the late afternoon. The house was big, but kind of dark, you know. Those lights that don't seem to light up properly, and there were strange shadows in the corners. The little boy, Mike, was quite nice, a bit quiet, but he seemed like a good kid. There was also a dog, an old mixed breed named Max. He stayed in the corner of the living room, sleeping all the time, really calm. When Mike's mom left, he stayed in the living room playing video games, and I took the opportunity to have a look around the house. It was big, with a somewhat old-fashioned decor, family portraits, those kinds of things. But there was one room, his mom's room, that was locked. I found it strange, but I didn't think much of it. On the second day, things started to get weird. Everything was calm, Mike was playing in the living room, and Max suddenly started barking. He perked up his ears and stared intently at the door to Mike's mom's room. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop barking, like he saw something there. Mike just looked at me and said, rather seriously, "This only happens when my mom works late." I laughed nervously and said it was nothing, but Max continued to growl softly, as if he were ready to attack. He only calmed down when I took him to the kitchen and closed the door. That made me uncomfortable, but I decided not to pay too much attention to it. The next few days were worse. Max barked and growled every night, always looking at the door of that room. There were times when he would stand there, staring at the doorknob as if waiting for something, or someone. I started feeling a chill, like someone was watching me, you know. And Mike, with that calm demeanor, always repeated the same thing: "It only happens when my mom works late." By the fifth night, the tension was unbearable. I was in the living room, looking at the clock and waiting for the time to leave, when Max started barking again. But this time, it was different. His fur was all bristled up, like he was scared. Suddenly, I heard a noise, like someone trying to open the door to Mike's mom's room. I froze for a second. The noise continued, a soft sound, like a nail scratching the wood. Mike was staring at the door, wide-eyed, saying nothing. "Mike, did you hear that?" I asked, trying not to show the panic rising up my spine. He just nodded, his face pale. "This only happens when my mom works late," he repeated. I felt cold sweat running down my forehead. I decided to approach the door. "Let's put an end to this nonsense," I thought. As I got closer, Max started barking frantically, growling as if he were seeing the devil himself. I touched the doorknob, but it was as cold as ice, and a shiver ran up my arm. Then, I heard a whisper. It wasn't Mike. It wasn't my voice. It was a faint, almost inaudible voice coming from inside the room. "Help me." I quickly pulled my hand back, my heart racing. Max began howling in a desperate way, and Mike, with a calm and serious look, just repeated, "It only happens when my mom works late." Not knowing what to do, I called Mike's mom. The phone rang a few times before she answered, and I could only say, "You need to come back now." She replied, but her voice was low, almost a murmur, as if she were far away. "I'm trapped. I'm trapped," and the call dropped. The noise in the room got louder, and Max began banging his head against the kitchen door, like he wanted to get out of there. Mike stood still, watching everything with a strange, almost absent look. "She always says she's trapped," he whispered, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Terrified, I grabbed Mike by the hand and ran out of the house with Max right behind us. As soon as we left, I noticed the noise stopped. Max finally quieted down. I didn't know what was going on in that house, but I knew I wasn't going back. I never managed to contact Mike's mom again. The following week, I tried asking around the neighborhood about them and found out that there was no mother. Mike had been living there with an aunt since his mom disappeared, over a year ago.
I was always one of those people who didn't believe in supernatural stuff. You know how it is, right? I always thought it was just stories to scare kids or something out of a movie. But after that night, man, I don't know what to think anymore. I adopted Max 3 years ago. A big German shepherd, with black and tan fur, all clumsy, but with a giant heart. He was the type that barked at everyone but had never shown fear. Always playful, wagging his tail, ready to chase after anything that moved. The truth is, with him around, I always felt safe. But that night, everything changed. I got home from work as usual, tired, just wanting to take a shower and relax. Max was at the door, as always, waiting for me, wagging his tail. But right away, I noticed he was different. He was restless, pacing back and forth, looking at the window in the living room that faced the backyard, as if he had seen something out there. I found it strange because he never acted like that. Usually, he'd lie on the rug, waiting for me to throw a toy for him to fetch. But this time, he seemed worried, a bit nervous. I decided to ignore it. I thought maybe he'd heard a cat in the backyard. I went to the kitchen to make something to eat, but Max wouldn't leave my side. He kept staring at the window in the living room, his fur all bristled up. Every few seconds, he'd look at me, as if he wanted to warn me about something. I went to the living room and took a peek out the window. It was dark outside, only the faint light from the street lamp illuminated a small part of the yard. I didn't see anything unusual. No sounds, nothing moving. I told Max, "Hey, boy, it's okay. It's just the wind, relax." But he kept growling softly, his eyes fixed on the same spot, like he was seeing something out there that I couldn't see. Then he started barking, out of nowhere, a desperate, high-pitched bark. It made me jump. My heart was racing. Max, who was always calm, now seemed panicked. I went back to the window, opened the curtains a bit, trying to see better. Nothing. Just the dark yard. But Max kept barking, and now he was staring directly at the back door that led to the yard. I decided to open the door and let him out. "Go on, Max, see what's bothering you." He bolted outside but suddenly stopped, right in the middle of the yard, looking toward a dark corner near the fence. That corner had always been a bit gloomy, the trees cast a dense shadow, but that night it seemed darker than usual. Max was standing still, frozen, his body tense, like he was waiting for something. Suddenly, he started backing up slowly, tail between his legs, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Then he began to growl again, a growl I had never heard before, a deep, frightening sound. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood at the door, not knowing if I should call him back or go out to see what was happening. Then Max let out a yelp, like he'd been hit or was in pain. He came running back inside, tail between his legs, panting, and hid under the kitchen table. I went to him, knelt down, and tried to calm him, but he was trembling, his eyes wide, and he kept looking at the door, like he was expecting something to follow him. That's when I heard it. A low sound, very faint, almost like a whisper coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then the sound got louder, clearer. It sounded like a voice, murmuring something I couldn't understand. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, just the wind passing through the trees. But Max was seeing something. He kept staring at the door, like he knew something was there. And then I heard it again, louder. "Paul," that made me freeze. The voice was whispered, drawn out, but it was saying my name. It couldn't be. I shook my head, trying to shake off the sound, but it continued, repeating my name, getting louder each time. "Paul." Max started barking again, a bark of desperation, like he was trying to warn me not to open the door. I backed away, unsure of what to do. I grabbed the phone, but my hand was shaking so much I could barely dial. And the whisper continued, now sounding like it was right at the door. A clear "Paul," almost as if someone was on the other side. I locked the door, closed all the windows, and sat on the floor, Max still under the table, trembling. I stayed there, motionless, listening to that sound that seemed to echo throughout the entire house. My name, repeated over and over, getting weaker each time, until it disappeared completely. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept all the lights on, listening to every noise, every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind. And Max? He never wanted to go out to the yard after dark again. He always stays close to me, like he's protecting me from something he saw but that I don't want to see. Since that night, I feel like something has changed. Like something is here, waiting. And honestly, I'm not sure if I'll ever find out what it is. And if it's up to me, maybe it's better that way. After a month of everything that happened, with Max's change in behavior, I made a decision. I decided to move out of that house. The night before my move, it happened again. Max started barking, he was very agitated, then he stopped barking and ran off, hiding under the kitchen table, and then, just like the last time, I heard someone calling my name again, a faint whisper, but enough to send a chill down my spine. At that moment, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went out to look around. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, as there were no signs of anyone nearby, but I had to find out who was calling me. I searched around the entire house and found nothing. When I got back inside, Max came running towards me, seeming to ask for help. At that moment, I felt that something was wrong with that house, so I grabbed Max, got into my car, and drove to the nearest hotel. We spent the night there. Max finally calmed down and slept through the night. The next day, I moved out as quickly as possible and never went back to that house. Max never acted that scared again, as if he had indeed seen something truly terrifying.